Hey guys, I am trying a new microphone today. Is the audio better or worse or no different?
Sounds better to me.
Sounds better? Okay,
Yeah.
cool. All right, we'll get started here in a few minutes. If you guys want to go ahead and less background hum, good. That's what I was aiming for. Let's go ahead and do our sign in and we'll get started in a few minutes. Do I have a music YouTube channel? You know, I've thought about posting some of my music on YouTube. Maybe I will at some point. I used to years ago, and I took it down. Um, but I've thought about creating a channel for some of my music. I've thought about recording some music again. Now, since we've been under quarantine, I have a little bit more spare time, but not really right now because I need to. I do have a Bandcamp page. I don't have a SoundCloud, but I do have a Bandcamp page. And if you guys are interested, I can send you guys a link to some of my stuff on Bandcamp. Uh, Remind me to do that at the end of the class period, and I'd be glad to send that link out. So, yeah, I've thought about recording some more music now that we have a little bit more time on our hands under quarantine. But I got to get caught up on your guys' essay grading. I'm behind on that, and I need to write the third exam, which I'm thinking will be due this Sunday night. I might move that down a little bit, but if I can get that exam posted by the end of the day today, I'm going to make it due on Sunday night. It'll be on Canvas for you guys. So yeah, I'll send you guys a link to some of my music. I'll do that at the end of class. Somebody remind me and I'll do it. I've got a few different Bandcamp pages that you guys can check out. So yeah, in terms of the exam, like I was saying, I'm still working on that, and my goal is to get that written by the end of the day so we can go ahead and have people start on that. And I'm thinking of making that due by Sunday night, and I am still working on grading those second essays. In fact, I'm thinking about just posting a recording of this lecture for my next period class. It's the same. It's general psychology. We're covering chapter 11 in that class too. So I was thinking about just posting the recording for that class so I can go ahead and get busy on getting those papers graded and getting the exam written. So I think I might do that. So today we're going to be covering chapter 11 on we're going to be covering chapter 11 on health and well-being. So let me go ahead and get those slides pulled up for you guys. All right, so there's quite a lot of material in this chapter in the textbook, and I'm certainly not covering everything that's in the chapter in this lecture. It would just take too long. There's a lot of stuff about obesity, and there's a lot of stuff about smoking, and I think might be some stuff on sexual health as well. And I'm going to skip those particular topics, and I'm just going to talk about health and well-being and stress management more generally, and talk a little bit about the topic of positive psychology towards the end of the chapter. So I've whittled it down to about 20, I think 20 slides I have for you guys on this chapter. And again, as I've said in the past, if I don't lecture on something, I have a tendency not to put it on the exam. So that's something to just be aware of. So this chapter covers health and well-being. And this is the area of psychology that's commonly referred to as health psychology. So health psychology, as the slide says, is the application of psychology to promote increased health, to promote an increased sense of well-being, This is actually where I did a little bit of specialized work in graduate school. As I've mentioned before, my graduate thesis was on the relationship between religiosity and sexual behavior patterns. And I've also been interested in the relationship between religion and spirituality and various measures of health. And I've published a little bit of research on that topic. And it turns out that having a solid spiritual life, and not to confuse religion and spirituality, because those are slightly different things, although overlapping. But there's a fair amount of research to suggest that having a healthy spiritual life and even some degree of religious affiliation may be good for your health. Now, that's not to say that the particular dogmas and beliefs of any particular religion are right or wrong, but there does seem to be some health benefit to having some degree of spiritual practice in your life. And that is something that's mentioned in this chapter. So I've done a little bit of work in that area, in the area of health psychology, involving the relationship between spirituality and health and religion and health. And a lot of my experience in graduate school was working for the UWF Health Psychology Laboratory. So this has been an area of personal interest of mine, and from a research perspective as well. So like I said, health psychology is the application of psychological principles in promoting health and well-being. And when we talk about well-being, we're talking about, as the slide says, a positive state that includes striving for optimal health and life satisfaction. So there's this focus in health psychology on maximizing your life. There's a fair degree of overlap between this and humanistic psychology, because humanistic psychology, as we talked about in the past, is concerned with maximizing our potential, maximizing happiness, and finding ways to promote people living to their fullest potential. And so there's some degree of similarities between health psychology and humanistic psychology. A lot of psychology has focused on how people go wrong, on psychopathology, for example, which we'll talk about in a later chapter. But the focus in health psychology is on how people can go right and how we can promote that sense of well-being. And a related area within health psychology is an area of psychology that's become known as positive psychology, which is talked about in this chapter. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Hopefully later today, we'll be able to get through all the material that I have for you guys. So health psychology utilizes what's known as the biopsychosocial model of health. And this is a model of health that integrates the different levels of our being in considering our health. This is kind of in contrast to the traditional medical model of health, which the textbook talks about. But in the traditional medical model, there's this sense of health being sort of a totally medical issue. It's something that doctors worry about. You know, when you're worried about your health, when something goes wrong, you go visit the doctor prescribes some medication, you do what they say, they patch you up and send you home. And to a fair degree, a lot of that still happens. You know, the traditional medical model is still alive and well. It hasn't completely gone away. You know, when you have particular infections, for example, if you're unfortunate enough to contract COVID-19, for example, which is the reason we're on Zoom right now and not in a classroom. If you were to contract an infection like that, you know, the traditional medical model would probably be in order. You go to the doctor, they treat you, and hopefully you recover from the illness. So the traditional medical model is kind of about patching people up when things go wrong. And the doctor is kind of seen as the authority figure. And you kind of do what they say. But in the biopsychosocial model, there's more of an emphasis on taking charge of your own health and seeing health as something more than just a biological issue, hence biopsychosocial. There's this acknowledgement that health is something that's influenced by multiple levels of our existence. So when we talk about health and illness, for example, the biopsychosocial model that health psychology relies upon, looks at psychological factors. What is it about our psychology that's playing a role in our health? It actually turns out that our psychology plays a significant role in influencing our health because our psychology influences our behaviors, right? So, depending upon your psychological state, and we're going to talk about stress in a second, but let's say you're really stressed out and you're not managing that stress in the most healthy ways. Let's say you're managing that stress by nicotine consumption or alcohol consumption, or by engaging in risky sexual behavior practices, lots of unprotected sex, for example, with maybe people that you don't know too well, which is some way that some folks deal with stress through compulsive sexual behavior. Or maybe it's through the use of illicit drugs, right? And there are a number of illicit drugs that a person could become involved with. But all of these are ways that a lot of people try to manage stress that aren't necessarily healthy, that are pretty unhealthy. And when you develop these habits, of course, it develops a negative impact on your long-term health. So if you can figure out ways to more successfully deal with stress, that can go a long way towards improving your health. That's why most of what we're going to talk about in this chapter today has to do with stress management. That's what I've chosen to focus on in this chapter, because it's a great example of the biopsychosocial model. The way we deal with stress affects our health. On the other hand, if you're stressed out, the way that you deal with that stress is by maybe working out, going for a jog every day or several times a week, or going to the gym to lift some weights, or maybe you have weights at home because the gyms are closed right now due to COVID-19. But if you engage in exercise, that's a great way to manage stress, and it's really, really good for your health. Meditation, spiritual practices are good for your health and also helpful for managing stress. Maybe you have a game night with your friends and play some Monopoly or some Call of Duty, or whatever it is that you're into, whether it's board games or video games. But you engage in some quality socialization where you have some fun and let loose, right? That's a healthy way to manage stress. So you can manage stress in a healthy way, and if you develop that habit, that will lead to improvements in your health. So your psychology is vitally important. There's this mind-body connection when it comes to health that is acknowledged by the biopsychosocial model. Your social environment also plays a significant role in affecting your health. Ashley Nelson says video games are a healthy way to manage stress. Well, everything in moderation, right? So, I have a Super Nintendo. It's a reissue of the original Super Nintendo system with old games on it. And and I play Metroid sometimes, and I'll play, Mario Brothers, and I probably Star Fox, and I don't, I probably don't spend that much time doing it. I maybe turn that system on maybe once a week, and when I do play, maybe for less than an hour or so. So we're not talking about spending hours and hours of a day. Anything can become an addiction, right? So for example, sex, right? Having an orgasm is actually can be good for you. It's a good release, right? It can be a stress release. But if you engage in compulsive sexual behavior, if you're acting out with multiple partners that you don't know very well without wearing protection, or you're engaging in compulsive porn use to the point where you're spending 5 to 6 hours a day just sitting on your computer watching porn, then obviously that's unhealthy, right? So in moderation, video games could be video games could be a healthy outlet, right? And I'm not saying, by the way, that porn is necessarily a good way to manage stress. I'm just saying that this is something that's been documented. A lot of young men these days are having problems with compulsive porn use, which there have been an increasing number of books that have been written about it. There are a number of online communities that have surfaced in recent years dedicated to folks who have a compulsive problem with this. So this is a real issue. I'm not bringing it up to be crass or shocking or anything, but this is one way that particularly young men these days have developed a tendency to misuse, right, and to use compulsively, and it's increasingly a problem for a lot of folks, and it's a real problem. There have been a number of books written about it, like I've said, and TED Talks on the topic. So it's a real issue. So I'm not bringing it up just to be shocking or inappropriate. It's something that's been getting increasing attention in the psychological community. So you can anything can be abused, right? A glass of wine in the evening might be a harmless way to reduce a little bit of stress. But if you're drinking an entire bottle every evening, then we're probably looking at alcoholism in that situation, right? And you're damaging your liver and your health, right? So it's a question of moderation, I would say. So I mean, this is if this is something that Donald commented on 6 to 5 hours of porn usage. Yeah, I'm just throwing that figure out there as as an extreme example. But if you look at the literature on this, it's a real problem. Look at the TED Talks that have been done on it. There's a book that came out recently that is called Your Brain on Porn, which is about the neurological effects of compulsive porn use. And apparently there's some evidence that it causes changes in the brain, similar to what you would see with a cocaine addiction or something like that. So it's something that has been getting some attention in the psychological literature, and there's been a lot of debate about it, but I think it's definitely something that a lot of folks are abusing probably as a way to manage stress or boredom or something like that. So our social conditions also play a role in affecting our health, according to this model. So having having plenty of friends, having a healthy social life, but also surrounding yourself with people who are a good influence on you. For example, with regard to obesity, there's a lot of evidence that if someone lives in a house with a spouse or a family member who is obese, they have a much greater likelihood of becoming overweight or obese themselves, just because of the social influence that has on the person. So our social environment plays a critical role in shaping our health behaviors due to the influence that other people have upon us, right? So all of these things interact with each other. So health is something that's influenced by our psychology. It's influenced by our social conditions, obviously our biology, and that's what the traditional medical model addresses. And you might even add a fourth box to this loop, this circle, which would be our spiritual life as well. And I think you could make a strong argument that having a good, healthy spiritual life would be something that we would want to add to this equation. That's just my personal bias, because psychology of religion and spirituality has been something that I've been interested in as a researcher for a number of years. Questions, comments at this point? I didn't mean to shock anybody or gross anybody out with the discussion of compulsive pornography use, but it is a real issue that you hear increasingly about in the psychological literature. Questions, comments at this point?
I think that's crazy. 6 to 5 hours of porn usage, like,
yeah,
Jesus, dude, that's, you gotta have some good grip strength and stamina there.
Yeah, but I mean, it's that's an extreme example, obviously, but it is a real problem that's been documented by a lot of psychologists and behavioral scientists. Neuroscience has begun to study the phenomenon of how porn affects the human brain. Look into the book Your Brain on Porn, and there's some interesting research in that book that might be worth taking a look at. It's just
I had a friend, sorry. I had a friend that was addicted to porn. He's pretty open about it because he switched from like obsessing over pornography to obsessing over the Bible. Quite different extremes.
right.
So he's now like extremely religious, and he takes all his stress and puts it towards his faith, which is
Right.
pretty cool. But like when he was addicted to pornography, he had a lot of built up stress. He got into fights a lot. So it's really cool to like hear about his past life as opposed to like who he is as a person now. Like if you met him, you would not guess it because he's so religious, and
Yeah.
it's really cool.
And if
And I
that,
love how open he is about it too.
yeah, and that's great that he's found a religion or a spiritual practice system that works for him, you know. And Caleb says, but if you study the pathology of addiction, people who are extreme addicts tend to focus that into a different extreme. Did you want to elaborate on that, Caleb?
Sure. Like for example, I've got a friend who is, and I grew up in a really conservative household, much like yourself. So when I say that, without any checks or balances, no, you see people tend to go from one extreme to the other. Um, like, let's take religion, for example. People who are converts to different religions tend to, if they were raised in a fundamental background, would tend to follow another religion fundamentally. Um, you see that from my point, I was raised Oneness Pentecostal, so um, my family is on my dad's side is super religious. My aunt doesn't wear pants, no jewelry, doesn't cut her hair. Basically like the Duggars. If anybody's seen 19 Kids and Counting. Um, except a little bit more cultish, I would say. And people who tend to leave that tend to uh, go into other ways of life, and it becomes more extreme. I'm not sure if I'm speaking clearly, if it's making sense to anybody.
No, you are making sense, Caleb. And I have seen that sort of thing before, where some folks might argue that the person is just replacing one addiction with another, right? But I'm not trying to denigrate religion or spiritual practice, but anything can be taken to an extreme, right? Anything can be taken to an unhealthy level, and I think that even obsession with religion could probably apply there as well. Great conversation, great discussion today. So when we talk about health psychology, a huge chunk of what health psychology has focused on is stress management. So that's kind of what I was going to focus on in this chapter, because all of those behaviors in the chapter that are discussed, like smoking, overeating and obesity, drug use, all of those things ultimately, to some degree, boil down to stress management, right? There's all of the common thread that connects all of those problematic health behaviors are unhealthy attempts to deal with stress. So I think talking about stress would be the central topic of the chapter. So when we talk about stress, we're talking about any sort of event that challenges an organism's ability to respond, right? Or ability to cope, to use another phrase. So any sort of event that challenges an organism's ability to respond or cope, we would refer to as that stress, is the experience of that. And that event would be referred to as a stressor. So a stressor is any environmental event or stimulus that threatens an organism. So when we engage in coping, there's a stress response. So stress responses include physical reactions in the body, behavioral responses like we've been talking about, and psychological responses. Ashley Nelson asks, can these coping mechanisms be linked to ADD? I've been told that people with ADD seek out stimulants. That may be the case. I'm not an expert on ADD and ADHD. I know that the drugs that are used to treat ADHD are often stimulants, like Adderall, for example, and Ritalin. Those are stimulants. And it does seem that folks with ADHD and ADD have a greater tendency to get bored more quickly. So it would make sense to me that they would seek out extra stimulation, either through the environment or through stimulant drug use. That it would make sense to me intuitively, but I'm not familiar enough with ADHD. I don't have enough expertise in that to really say definitively, but it sounds like it's a behavior pattern that would make sense from what understanding I do have of ADHD. So when we talk about stressors, health psychologists tend to divide stressors into two broad categories. You have your major life stressors and your daily hassles. So your major life stressors are those large disruptions. They're often very unpredictable. As we see here on the top picture, there's a dude standing in front of his house that looks like it was just destroyed by a tornado. Ashley Nilsson has commented, this is personal, but I'd like to share my personal experience. I have sought out drugs, sex, and have had a nicotine addiction and have spoken to my therapist about it all. And he told me that I should get tested for ADD because this behavior may be linked to ADD, although I have never been tested for it, so I can't be quite certain. Yeah, so I mean, if your therapist seems to think there's a connection there, and I do appreciate your candor, Ashley. That's allowing yourself to be very vulnerable in front of the class, and I do appreciate that level of honesty. But it would make sense, that folks with ADHD would get bored very easily, and feel a need for stimulation as a result of that boredom. And you can seek out stimulation through all of the means that you've listed, and all of those behaviors can become compulsive because when you engage in those behaviors, they cause a massive dopamine release. Everything that you just mentioned, all of those behaviors cause a dopamine release when you engage in them. And that's the neurotransmitter that we know is highly associated with addiction. So I wouldn't be surprised if there is a link between compulsive behavior patterns, addictive behavior patterns, and ADHD. That would be actually an interesting topic to write your third paper about, because you get to pick your topic for your third paper. So, I bet you there's some research that's been done on it, and I would probably learn something from that myself. So I really appreciate your candor and openness with the class and sharing on that topic. And that takes a lot of courage to make yourself vulnerable like that. So I can appreciate that. So when we talk about major life stressors, we're talking about huge disruptions to our lives. Some folks might argue that this COVID-19 outbreak could be considered a major life stressor for many people. Would anybody say that this has been a major life stressor for any of you guys?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I've had to completely redesign all my classes as a result of that, so that's been pretty stressful. I can't go see my grandma right now, who I'm really close with. When she needs me to go grab something for her from the store, I just drop it off on her front doorstep and leave, which is kind of sad, right? And we wave at each other through the window, which is sad. I've cried about it, because I'm an emotionally sensitive guy. So I've had some tears over that. And, people are dying from this disease. Most people who get it will have relatively mild symptoms, but I think the mortality rate is something like 3 or 4%. It depends on what website you read. I've read anywhere from 1% to 5% mortality rate with this disease. So I don't know what the true number is, but yeah, I think we could probably count what's going on right now as a major life stressor. And if any of you guys just need somebody to talk to anytime, if you want to have a private Zoom conference, you just need somebody to talk to, I'm here for you. We can schedule that. I am not a licensed therapist, but I do have a background in psychology, as you know, and I can be a listening ear. If you just need somebody to vent to, we can do that. You know, I'm here for you guys. And also I recommend our Active Minds Club is meeting on Zoom at 3 o'clock on Wednesdays, and we talk about mental health issues there as well. So that might be a place where some of you guys might want to, come join us on 3 o'clock at 3 o'clock on Wednesdays via Zoom. So daily hassles, as you might surmise from the slide, are just those everyday little things that pile up, right? You know, you go to the store just to buy some coffee and a gallon of milk, and you've got to wait in line for 20 minutes because there's only one register open at Walmart, right? And all of the self-checkout registers have lines on them too. That's a daily hassle. Having to sit in traffic constantly, daily hassle, right? Just those little things that pile up on you. Michelle Hamilton writes, being an addict in recovery and having a family full of addicts, alcoholics, there is a list of mental health issues when it comes to addicts. Instead of seeking out proper care and or medication, people tend to just self-medicate and in turn overindulge and become addicts. Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. And for those of you here who are in recovery or you think you might be struggling with some form of addiction, I know for a fact that right now that AA meetings, Narcotics Anonymous, Sex Addicts Anonymous, there are all sorts of 12-step support groups. 12-step programs come from a spiritual perspective, so that's something to be aware of, and you've got to be comfortable with a spiritual perspective and if you're going to do a 12-step program. But there are a lot of 12-step programs who are doing Zoom meetings right now and phone meetings, and I think that's something that might be helpful to some folks here who struggle with those sorts of issues. So here is a list of common stressful events. One thing that's interesting to note here is that an event doesn't necessarily have to be a negative event in order for it to be considered a stressful event. If you look here, marriage is considered a very stressful event. And for anyone here who has ever gotten married, you can relate to how stressful planning a wedding can be. It's expensive, it's involved, you're trying to make everybody happy with the wedding plans and the wedding date, and it's a joyous event, but there's a lot of stress that goes into getting married. And maybe some of you guys can relate to that. Also, getting a promotion at your job, seen as a positive sort of event, but can be stressful because you have a new set of responsibilities. You're getting paid more, but you also have new responsibilities and you have a greater weight on your shoulders than you've had before. So there's stress involved even in events that we might consider to be positive events. An event doesn't have to be negative, so to speak, to be considered stressful. Does anybody have any stressful events going on in their lives right now? Obviously the COVID-19 outbreak, but does anybody need to vent about any stressors happening? Anybody going through some stress? Ashley?
I'm very stressed out about this whole Zoom thing. I am afraid that because we're doing online schooling that I'm not going to be as engaged in my classes. I'm
Right.
going to be a lot less I'm going to be more lenient on completing my work.
Right.
And I'm afraid that I'm not going to learn anything because I'm going to be cheating so much. I'm not going to lie, I'm going to cheat on a lot of stuff
Right.
because of online schooling. And it's really stressful because I know that, well, for one, I wouldn't be earning my grades. And then two, I wouldn't care as much about my grades.
Well, I would cut yourself a little bit of slack for one thing, but I am doing my best to try to keep the lectures as engaging as possible, even though we're not in a classroom. And, you can still read your textbook, and that you can still take notes out of your textbook. You can still take notes during the lecture. So, there are things that you can do to increase the likelihood that you'll that you'll have a more positive experience. Trying to find toilet paper, amen to that. In fact, I'm going to go out after class is over and I'm going to stock up on a few things because the governor has issued a stay-at-home order starting tomorrow. So I'm going to try to stock up. I need to get some more coffee, and I need to try to find some more TP and some water, and it'll be nobody is following that order, laughing my ass off. Donald says, yeah. So it'll be interesting to see how that all pans out. But yeah, I need to track down some more TP myself, and if I have to, you know, I can use paper towels or something, you know. I mean, paper towels seem to be a little bit easier to find than toilet paper. Being the only adult in my home is sort of stressful, but at least I have all my Zoom classes and trying to homeschool my son. Yeah, so this whole situation has been stressful for a lot of people. Has anybody here lost their job over this thing? Is anybody out of work because of the shutdowns?
Yeah, I did.
I did too.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah, my wife, she lost her job temporarily because of the outbreak. So, you know, my household can relate to that as well. Ashley Nelson, my mom has lost her job and my father is now our only source of income until he loses his as well. Devin, luckily I'm a pizza delivery driver, so I'll be good for a little bit. Yeah, there's a little bit of job security there, I'd say. I'm very thankful that I have the position that I have where I can work remotely. And, you know, I'm one of the very fortunate people. So I'm very thankful, very, very thankful. Yeah, Donald.
The government did deem me as an essential personnel since I work for Publix, but it can be pretty stressful because we try to implement a 6 feet shopper rule, which nobody is following.
Yeah.
Increasing the spread of the virus. I'm at the seafood counter last night. I go out there, I look towards the meat case, see a whole gaggle of people at least a couple inches apart, ignoring all the big signs we have out there, ignoring the people on the intercom saying stay 6 feet apart or you're going to spread the virus. People are just a problem.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Did you guys put up plexiglass yet?
I don't know. I don't think we have. I hear Walmart's issuing their workers masks, and I've been told that we're not allowed to wear ours. I'm gonna wear mine regardless.
Yeah, that's kind of crazy that they're not letting you wear a mask.
Yeah, I'm not going to risk my own life and the people I live with being a carrier of that virus over that job.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'll be risking my job security for that.
Yeah. Antonio says stocking groceries at Winn-Dixie feels like a death sentence right now. I bet it does. So one of the older models of the stress response that's been around for a really long time, this was associated with the work of a Swiss physician. I believe he was Swiss, by the name of Hans Selye. And he was one of the early people to study the stress response. And he came up with this model called the General Adaptation Syndrome, which divides the stress response into 3 stages: alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. So in the alarm stage, according to this model, your body mobilizes for a fight or flight response. And then, you know, you're getting ready to respond to the stressor. And then the resistance stage is the stage in which you're actively responding to the stressor, either through fighting or fleeing. And then the exhaustion stage kicks in if the stressor persists too long and it's undealt with, then bodily systems begin to break down and fail. Like the immune system, for example, there's interesting research that's been done on this. Chronic long-term stress weakens your immune system. However, short-term stress actually has somewhat of a boosting effect on the immune system. So a short-term stressor would be something like an intense workout at the gym, for example, or running a 5K. You know, so short-term stressors actually, 300 plus studies have demonstrated this, that these short-term stressors can actually really have a boosting effect on the immune system. But our immune systems were not designed to deal with chronic long-term stressors, because when you get stressed out, there's hormones like cortisol and adrenaline that get released. And cortisol in particular has an effect of suppressing your white blood cells. Yeah, Tatiana. Did you have a comment, Tassi?
Say that again?
Did you have a comment? You turned your microphone on.
Okay.
No worries. I was just making sure that you had the chance to speak if you had something you wanted to share. So in any case, long-term stress elevates your cortisol levels for prolonged periods of time. And cortisol is one of those stress hormones that mobilizes you for a fight or flight response. It works along with epinephrine and norepinephrine, like we see here in this slide. So the fight or flight response is involved, is connected rather to the hormones epinephrine, which is the same thing as adrenaline, norepinephrine, and cortisol. And these are hormones that mobilize your body for a fight or flight response, which involves pupil dilation, tunnel vision, getting a dry mouth. I remember the last time I got into a car accident a few years ago in California. I was so shaken up by the experience. My mouth got so dry I could barely speak, and I could barely talk to the police officer when she was doing the police report of the accident. My mouth was so dry. I had such bad cotton mouth. It was really bad. Your breathing becomes fast and shallow, heart rate increases, sweating increases, and if this is prolonged, you get insomnia, you have trouble focusing on things. If you're a dude, you're gonna have trouble forming a sexual response, getting an erection. It becomes, practically impossible for that to happen during a fight or flight response. Muscle tension increases. Muscle tension increases throughout the body. And these are the physiological signs of a fight or flight response. And if this is short term, like I said, and it's over pretty quickly, it has a boosting effect on the immune system. However, if your body sustains this state over a long period of time because you're chronically stressed out, then this has a very negative effect on the immune system, particularly because of the hormone cortisol. Cortisol kills white blood cells when cortisol levels are sustained over a long period of time. Amy Rogers says, no wonder why my immune system sucks. So yeah, if you're chronically stressed out, you're going to get sick more often. There was a classic study that was done where they gave a bunch of people a survey to determine how stressed out they were. They took a stress survey, and these people were voluntarily exposed to the common cold. So there was this mist that was sprayed in the people's faces that had the common cold in it, and they were well paid for their participation because they were getting made sick on purpose, right? So these were healthy participants, that they didn't expect to have any long-term complications from this. So they sprayed these people in the face with the common cold, and then they compared the more stressed out folks to the less stressed out folks. And the folks who reported being more stressed out on their stress survey contracted the cold at a greater rate, and their symptoms were worse, and it took longer for them to recover from the cold. Whereas the less stressed out people, they contracted the cold at a lower rate, and those who did contract it, the cold didn't last as long, right? So that was evidence that the immune system was suppressed in the more stressed out participants in that study. One stress response that has been increasingly studied in recent years is what's known as the tend and befriend response, which is originally this was something that was studied by actually she's a sociologist who studies health by the name of Shelley Taylor. And she came up with this phrase, tend and befriend response. And she said that this particular stress response is more common among women, although anybody can engage in it, but women have more of a natural inclination to engage in this stress response. But this is the tendency to seek social support and social comfort when stressed out. And I'm not sure why my camera is cutting out here. It's having some issues with my camera there. That was happening yesterday too. My camera keeps cutting out. I'm not sure why. But the tend befriend response is associated with the release of the hormone oxytocin. Interestingly enough, oxytocin is the same hormone that gets released when a woman is breastfeeding. It's the same hormone that gets released when someone has an orgasm, for example. And that's a theory as to why people might feel closer to each other after they've engaged in sex, is because when you have an orgasm, you get an oxytocin release. And this oxytocin release makes you feel more connected to the person that you're with. So, so social behaviors, seeking social support of others when you're stressed out, is associated with oxytocin release. It's released when a woman is breastfeeding in both the mother and child, and it's also released in a person when they have an orgasm. So it's seen as the hormone associated with connection to other people. So where there's oxytocin, there's a feeling of connection to others. So I kind of already talked about this a little bit already, but when we're stressed out, a lot of us have a tendency to seek out comfort when we're stressed, right? We might engage in certain behaviors that aren't so healthy, such as eating junk food. Like we see here in the slide, it says stressed is desserts spelled backwards. And it actually is. So stressed is actually desserts spelled backwards. So that's an interesting thing to point out. But people do, yeah, I know, it's kind of interesting, kind of fascinating to note that, isn't it? But people do tend to seek out comfort food, so to speak, you know, and some people prefer sweets, eating a lot of candy and sweets when they're stressed out. Other people are more into salty fried foods, but it's the idea of comfort food, right? So, you know, we might seek out some comfort, some dopamine release through food. Other folks may be more inclined towards nicotine consumption or through cigarettes or vaping, for example, or the use of illicit drugs. You know, there are a number of drugs that one might seek out, alcohol consumption. And all of these are behaviors that can become compulsive and addictive when we use them as a way of self-medicating ourselves, like somebody said earlier. You know, it's basically self-medicating, that you're trying to make yourself feel better, right? So we say these are negative stress responses because they make us feel better in the short term, but if they become a habit, they have a really negative long-term effect on your health. So when we talk about heart disease, genetics plays a really big role here. And in fact, if you have a parent who has had heart disease or had a heart attack, you definitely want to keep an eye on this, as I do. My mother died of a heart attack at the age of 48, which was really young. So, you know, I have to really keep an eye on my cardiovascular fitness. I try to exercise regularly. You know, I quit using nicotine a long time ago. I used to smoke, and I vaped for a while after that, but I've quit both of those things, and I'm completely nicotine free now. I've been nicotine free for a while, and I'm pretty happy about that. And that was a really difficult habit to break. And for anyone in the room who's ever had that addiction, you can relate to how difficult it is to quit nicotine, whether that's through smoking or vaping. Incredibly difficult habit to break. And I'm really glad that I've already quit a while back, because now with this COVID-19 outbreak, you know, you're at greater risk. If you vape or smoke, you know, you're going to struggle more if you get the virus, because your lungs are already going to be coming into that situation at a disadvantage. So yeah, thank you, Gene, for the congrats. Yeah, it's one of the best health decisions I've ever made. And for any of you who still have that habit, I encourage you not to give up. Michelle says, I just tried to give up smoking for my drugs and behavior class. I was not able to right now. Yeah, it's difficult, you know, and I tried many, many times before I was successful. You know, probably a dozen or more times I attempted to quit before I was finally successful. It's just, I had to keep at it. So I'm really glad that I did, though, because, you know, my genetics are such that heart disease runs in my family. Like I said, my mother died at 48 due to a heart attack. And I don't think it helped that she was a 2-pack a day smoker for most of her adult life. So, you know, a pack and a half to 2 packs a day, she was really bad with the smoking. So I think that played a role in her early death. And, you know, my father died at the age of 37 of an accidental drug overdose. So both addiction and heart disease run in my family. So I'm very careful and cautious about substance use. You know, I don't drink at all anymore. You know, I used to drink a little bit here and there, but you know, these days I don't drink at all anymore. I don't use any nicotine. I try to stay in pretty good shape, you know, exercising, and because I'm aware that these are tendencies that run in my family. Donald says, I went cold turkey and threw my last pack of menthols away. That was more than a year ago. It's awesome, man. Yeah, cold turkey is hard. I wasn't able to do it that way. I had to use a nicotine patch for a while, and you know, it was a slow progression. So when I quit smoking, I switched to vaping for a while, and then when I quit vaping, I wore nicotine patches for a few months, and then when I quit the patches, I used gum occasionally, and now I'm not using any nicotine at all. So it was a slow, stepwise progression for me. But if you can do it cold turkey, you know, more power to you. Took a lot of grit. Yeah, absolutely. Chewing gum helps. Yeah, I would agree with that. I do chew gum occasionally myself. All right. So when we talk about personality traits, right? I got the baby flicking somebody off here. Yeah, I thought that was funny too. When we talk about personality and health, you know, it's personality plays a role here, particularly when we look at people who have really hostile, aggressive sorts of personalities, which we refer to as a type A personality pattern. So the type A personality pattern involves competitiveness, having this extreme orientation towards high achievement, often aggressiveness and hostility towards other people, a tendency towards restlessness and impatience with other people, and trouble relaxing, right? And I think I have some type A tendencies myself in certain situations, although sometimes I can be pretty relaxed. You know, I'm probably somewhere between the two extremes of type A and B, as many people are, but I do recognize some of these tendencies within myself. I get impatient sometimes. I get restless. I have trouble sitting still a lot. And you know, you might see some ADHD tendencies, you know, in there as well. But people who have these type A personality tendencies tend to have higher rates of heart disease, stroke. It's associated with negative health outcomes. So if you can learn to relax, it's good for your health. You know, there's nothing wrong with being competitive and wanting to achieve a lot in life, and that's something I can completely relate to. But at the same time, you've also got to learn when to turn it off. You've got to learn when to be able to relax. And sort of the opposite personality trait that you hear talked about is the type B behavior pattern, which is a more easygoing, relaxed sort of personality. You know, these folks are characterized by a more non-competitive nature, more relaxed, more easygoing, more go with the flow, right? So, and that personality pattern is associated with lower rates of heart disease, stroke, heart attack, aneurysms, all sorts of cardiovascular events. So if you can learn to relax, it goes a long way towards your health. And for me, meditation is a practice that I've taken up. I practice meditation. Probably about half an hour a day on average. I meditate, and it helps me to relax and let go of things that are stressing me out. And I think that I perceive that it's benefiting my health. Last time I went to the doctor, my blood pressure was really good. It was 117/28 was my blood pressure, which is pretty respectable for a guy my age. So I think 120/80 is considered good, and mine was 117/78. So I was pretty proud of that blood pressure reading, and I think quitting nicotine and practicing meditation and going for jogs has played a really important role in getting me to that level, because my blood pressure used to be a little bit high. I was kind of pre-hypertensive for a while, so I'm really happy that I've been able to get it down to a healthier level. Primary and secondary appraisal. So appraisal is the process of evaluating stressors and how we're going to respond to a stressor. So your primary appraisal is the process of evaluating whether or not an event is a stressor in the first place, right? So a lot of what makes something a stressor is the way we think about the event, the way we interpret the event, right? So if we can learn to interpret events as not necessarily being stressors. For example, this COVID-19 outbreak, I kind of made an effort to see this event as an opportunity to practice my online teaching skills and as an opportunity to get some lectures recorded. I've been wanting to record lectures for a long time. It's something I've been talking about for a long time. And this is an opportunity to practice doing that, right? It's an opportunity to get better at online teaching. It's an opportunity to spend a little bit more time with my wife. It's an opportunity to have a little bit more free time at home, right? So I'm trying to reframe that. Is my audio still cutting out? Can you guys hear me?
You're good.
Okay, because Kenneth said he couldn't hear me. Maybe it's Kenneth's connection. Okay, so yeah, if you can just learn to reframe events in a way so that you don't perceive them as stressors, then that is one approach, just reframing that primary appraisal process. But inevitably, some events will be perceived as stressors. Inevitably, sometimes there's no way you can BS yourself into believing that something's not a stressor, right? So if something is indeed a stressor for you, then that brings you to the secondary appraisal process, which is the process by which you determine how you are going to respond and manage that stressor. Okay, what am I going to do about it is the question that we're asking here in the secondary appraisal process. So that involves coping strategies. So most coping strategies fall into one of two broad types of coping. You have emotion-focused coping and problem-focused coping. So emotion-focused coping involves engaging in efforts to deal with the negative emotions, right? So, that's where a lot of the problem behaviors can come in, because you're trying to make yourself feel better. Like we talked about, you might be tempted to engage in some of those unhealthy behaviors that we were discussing in an effort to make yourself feel better. That would be emotion-focused coping in a negative way. On the other hand, if maybe you get involved in some spiritual practices like meditation, or maybe you go work out at the gym, or seek social connection to other people and deal with those feelings in a healthy way, then you're engaging in healthy emotion-focused coping. So emotion-focused coping can be healthy or unhealthy, but it's an attempt to manage your emotional response to the stressor. Problem-focused coping, on the other hand, involves confronting the stressor directly so that you can eliminate the stressor from your life. Donald says, inhale, count to 4, exhale, count to 4. Yeah, and a lot of forms of meditation involve breath work like that. Breath work it can be a very effective way to deal with stress. Some people like to make fun of it sometimes, but I've found for myself that breath work can be incredibly helpful. Problem-focused coping involves confronting the stressor directly. And sometimes it's possible to do this. So let's say you don't get along with your boss at work. Let's say your boss is just an ass, right? That maybe you could, try to work things out with your boss, try to talk things out, right? Sit down with him, have a conversation, like, look, how can we get along civilly? What can we do about this situation? If that doesn't work, maybe you could try to find a different place to work, right? That would be an example of problem-focused coping. But it's not always possible to get rid of the stressor immediately. Sometimes we're backed into a corner, and emotion-focused coping is the only thing that we have available to us. But when it's possible, we could try to come up with ideas as to how to confront the stressor directly to remove it from our lives. And when we can do that, that's preferable, but it's not always possible. So positive psychology, like I mentioned earlier towards the beginning of the lecture, is a branch of psychology that focuses on promoting happiness in particular, helping people reach their fullest potential. You might consider it sort of a modern offshoot of humanistic psychology. Martin Seligman is usually considered the founder of positive psychology. He was originally trained as a clinical psychologist, and somewhere along the way in his career, he got tired of just focusing on problems all the time, just treating people's psychological disorders. As he put it in his TED Talk on positive psychology, he got tired of playing spot the loony, as he called it, right? So he said, instead of focusing on all these ways that people go wrong, let's look at how we can promote a sense of well-being and happiness in people's life. And he calls this psychological approach positive psychology. And it's really taken off in recent years. And if you watch Seligman's TED Talk on this, if you just Google Martin Seligman positive psychology, he's got a really good TED Talk which goes into this in a lot more depth. And I almost always play that TED Talk in class when I lecture on this, but video sharing through Zoom is kind of spotty, so I'm not doing that now. But he looks at happiness from three angles. He says that there are three approaches to promoting happiness in life, so to speak. The first approach is what he calls the pleasant life. And he says this is the most shallow way to approach happiness. It only goes so far because the pleasant life is all about just seeking sensory pleasure, right? So eat some vanilla ice cream sometime, right? And you might notice that on the first scoop, it tastes really good. It's nice, it's sweet. The second scoop, it's still pretty good. But the more bites you have of the ice cream, the more bland it gets, right? The less rewarding it gets with each mouthful. And that's kind of how pleasure is, right? Pleasure can become very satiating, meaning that, you get so much of it and it just stops being rewarding. You get habituated to it, right? And it takes more and more stimulation for you to get the same kick, right? And that's often how addiction can develop, right? So, for example, nicotine. I can speak from experience as someone who used to be addicted to nicotine myself, and many of you can probably relate. An ambulance going by. The first time you get a hit of nicotine, it is really powerful, right? It makes you lightheaded. Some people even report getting nauseated from it. But for me, it was just a kick of just pure pleasure overload, right? And it's like, wow, it just kicks you in the face, right? But then when you become a smoker or a vapor, you're not going to get that kick just off one puff. You might have to, smoke an entire cigarette to get that kick, or you might have to burn up an entire vape cartridge in order to get the same kick that you used to get out of just one hit, right? And pleasure has that way of habituating. It has that tendency to become more and more, to become less and less rewarding, rather, is what I'm trying to say, right? So it only goes so far. The pursuit of pleasure, after a while, it starts to become less and less rewarding over time. And that's what Martin Seligman talks about in his TED Talk, is that the pursuit of pleasure can only go so far in promoting happiness. That if you really want to be happy in life, you really want to pursue one of these other two options. So the next level would be the good life, which he calls a life of engagement. So the life of engagement, or the good life, as Seligman calls it, is a life dedicated to the pursuit of engagement, meaning that you do meaningful work, that you get completely caught up and engaged in what it is you're doing, and you experience regularly a sense of flow, which means that you become fully absorbed in what you're doing, right? So if you're a teacher, you get fully absorbed in the lecture that you're giving, and time basically stops, right? And an hour and 15 minutes goes by just like that, because you've been fully absorbed in what it is that you're doing, or whatever it is that you're doing, whether it's lecturing or trading stocks or operating in an operating room as a surgeon. You become fully absorbed in what you're doing. So the idea here is to pursue meaningful work, right? And to become completely absorbed and engaged in that work, so that you frequently experience what positive psychologists call the flow state, which is that feeling of complete absorption in whatever it is that you're doing. And you're going to get a lot more happiness out of life if you pursue that than if you just pursue pleasure all the time, right? And then the next final level up is what Seligman calls the meaningful life. And this is the life of service. This is the life of giving yourself to something larger than yourself, right? Maybe you do a lot of charity work, or maybe you live a life of service to other people, like Mother Teresa, for example, or like Dr. Martin Luther King. But you give your life to helping other people, to promoting a cause that's greater than yourself. You give yourself to a spiritual practice or to charity, but the central thing here is that you live your life and in service of others, and you live your life to help other people, which is what Seligman, like I just said, calls the meaningful life. So as the quote here from Seligman says, just as the good life is something beyond the pleasant life, the meaningful life is something beyond the good life. So the highest pursuit, according to the positive psychology approach, is the meaningful life, giving your life to a cause that's greater than yourself. But you can also get a lot of happiness out of having rewarding work where you're fully engaged in what you're doing. Thoughts, comments on this? Michelle Hamilton. And 12-step programs like AA or NA, they use service work to help people to learn to live with. Yeah, that's very true. In fact, in the 12 steps, I think it's the 10th or 11th step, right, which involves, is it step 11 that involves living a life of service to other people? I think step 10 is constant contact with your higher power, right? Or is it continued inventory? I'm having trouble remembering, but the 12-step programs involve taking a moral inventory of your life, which is the 4th step, and then you continuously take inventory in your life to keep track of, what it is that you should not be doing, so you quit doing those things that are destructive. But not only do you take inventory of your behavior and quit doing those things that are destructive, you replace those destructive behaviors through service to other people. So that's why if you get into a 12-step program and you stay sober, you'll be encouraged to do service work. And that could involve, chairing a meeting, or that could involve sponsoring somebody. There are various things that you could do that would involve that service. But the idea is that if you dedicate yourself to a life of service, helping other alcoholics or other addicts, that will keep you from relapsing yourself, because other people are counting on you. And that's my understanding. Would you say that that's about right, Michelle, or did I misrepresent the 12-step philosophy in any way there?
I would definitely say that's correct. I actually didn't finish doing the steps myself, just because I had my dad die shortly after I got clean, so
Yeah.
I kind of didn't work at the program the way I needed to. But hey, I'm here taking 6 college classes, still completely sober, almost 2 years.
What is it? They say progress, not perfection, right?
Yeah, progress, not perfection. And, to use what we learn in all the affairs of our life, and not only help others in the recovery programs, but just to try to help people in general as a whole. That is kind of why I'm getting a psychology degree.
That's awesome. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate all the openness today from you guys. We've had some good quality discussion, and folks have really opened up, and that means a lot to me. So yeah, in the 12-step programs, it's all about giving your life to a spiritual way of life and helping others. So I would say that that's very consistent with Seligman's view of the meaningful life. So in the last few slides here, I just have a few more things. I already mentioned religion and spirituality. I don't want to rehash that too much because I've already talked about it a little bit, but there's a lot of evidence in health psychology in particular that having a solid religious spiritual center to your life can do a lot of good things for your health and a lot of good things for your well-being. And, I'm not advocating for any particular religion. I'm not saying you should go become a Christian or a Buddhist or a Muslim. You find whatever works for you. And even if you're an atheist or an agnostic, you can still be spiritual, even if you're an atheist or agnostic. You don't have to believe in God to be spiritual. And I think that's something that a lot of folks don't realize. To me, being spiritual just means that you live a life of connection to others and to the universe, right? To me, that's what spirituality is. And to some people, that involves a belief in God, and to some people, it doesn't, right? So spirituality is just connection, as far as I'm concerned. So to sum up, to stay healthy and have a sense of well-being, there are some good general guidelines to follow here. Eating natural foods, if you can afford it, watching your portion sizes, watching your substance use, particularly alcohol and other substances. If you're going to drink in moderation, but definitely don't abuse alcohol. Stay active. Try to avoid smoking and nicotine use if you possibly can. Be responsible with your sexual behavior. Learning to relax, that's been a big one for me that I've had to focus on a lot. And that's something that meditation practices helped me out a lot with, and learning to deal with stress in a healthy way, which has been the central subject of our discussion today. Having a strong sense of social support. Again, 12-step programs, there's a lot of consistency here with the 12-step approach because it has, there's the strong social component there. And try some happiness exercises. And if you're interested in happiness exercises, Google Martin Seligman's happiness exercises. He's got a lot of them out there with regard to health psychology. I've got a comment from Amy. I feel that I'm an atheist raised in a Christian house, and I've always thought that spirituality was only related to religion. So I always avoided calling myself spiritual. Thanks for the clarity. Yeah, totally. I mean, when it comes to the existence of an anthropomorphic God, I have no idea. I'm, on the record as an agnostic myself. I don't know whether or not there's an anthropomorphic, God out there. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But to me, spirituality just means being connected to others and having a sense of connection with the universe. And that's a definition of spirituality that works for me, and I'm glad it's helpful to you as well, Amy. Donald says there's nothing you can gain from hitting crack cocaine. Crack is whack, as Whitney Houston was famous for saying. Yeah, crack is whack. Quotes with Donald. All right, so that's going to be it for chapter 11, and the third exam will cover chapters 8 through 11, if I remember correctly. Please don't do cocaine. Cocaine ruined your brain. You guys are the greatest. You guys are cracking me up. So if you guys have if you guys have any questions or comments, I'll be free to take those via email, or if you want to meet with me privately via Zoom. The test is not going to be due today. I'm still writing the test. I'm going to probably make it due by Sunday night. Yeah, and I'm going to post a study guide for it as well. I may extend that due date, but I'm working on that, and yeah, so that won't be due today, but I am writing it right now, and I'll post a study guide. And again, if anybody wants to meet with me privately via Zoom, we can do that. Email me your questions, and I usually respond to emails within 24 hours or less. So it's been a real fun discussion today, one of the better discussions we've had. I appreciate all the openness and sharing. Yes, it will be timed. There will be a 1 hour time limit on the exam. But you know, you can do it open book though. So you know, there's nothing that I can do to stop you guys from using your books. I'm not there, so you know, I'm not going to try to fight that reality. I know some of you guys are going to do it anyway. So we'll do it open book, but there will be a 1 hour time limit. So if you spend all your time looking up every answer, then you know you're going to run out of time, right? So you know, look up things judiciously. Don't spend all your time looking up every answer, or you'll run out of time on the exam. Just read fast. Cool. Yeah. So I'll get that posted for you guys soon, and yeah, great class meeting. I agree. I appreciate all you guys, and I will see you guys on Tuesday. Make sure you sign in. I'm going to stay signed in for 1 more minute to give you guys who haven't signed in the chance to do so. Just your first and last name for attendance. And then in 1 minute, I'm going to go ahead and sign out. So I'll see you guys on Tuesday.
Thanks.
Yep. You have a good day too, Amy.